Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today, we mark the inauguration of the Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative here at the University of Michigan. Before I hand it over to Dr. Dewar, I want to take a moment to introduce the initiative and some of our upcoming events. The Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative advances housing research and policy in Michigan. Our goal is to inform policy through interdisciplinary research on housing as it relates to equity and health, race, socioeconomic status, gender, and aging. We envision a world where decent, safe, affordable, and healthy housing is available to everyone. We would like to thank Poverty Solutions for co-sponsoring this event, and we would like to thank again Poverty Solutions, the School of Public Health, the Office of the Vice President for Research, and the Public Engagement Faculty Fellowship for their guidance and financial support over the last year. Starting in the winter term, we are excited to launch our speaker series where you will hear from researchers at UM working with various organizations across the state on projects related to homelessness, housing discrimination, and the intersections of healthcare and housing insecurity. We will also be showcasing projects ranging from discriminatory mortgage lending practices in health to the impact of housing instability on students' mental health. We encourage those who are interested to reach out, as we are always looking for new opportunities to engage and partner with. I realize I haven't introduced myself. My name is Dr. Rashanik Medipana. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Public Health, and I'm the director of the Housing Solutions for Health Equity. I'm sorry. I'm really nervous. This is really exciting. Now I'd like to kick off the Housing Solutions for Health Equity inaugural speaker event. We're excited to host Dr. Alexa Eisenberg, Ms. Tonya Phillips, and Dr. Margaret Dewar to discuss today's topic titled A Public Health Crisis, Not a Property Dispute, Learning from COVID-19 Eviction Responses Measures in Detroit. We will have two presentations followed by a Q&A session. During the event, we invite you to place your questions in the Q&A. Now I'm excited to introduce Dr. Margaret Dewar, who will be moderating this session. Dr. Dewar is a professor emerita of urban and regional planning at the Taubman College of Architecture and Planning, and also a faculty advisor at Poverty Solutions. Welcome, Dr. Dewar.
Thank you, Rashanik. Welcome, everybody. The reason for this session is that Michigan has a major eviction problem. Prior to the pandemic, landlords were bringing lawsuits to evict tenants at an annual rate equal to 1 in 6 rental households. With some respite during the pandemic, now eviction lawsuits are edging up to the pre-pandemic levels. So it's time to work on solving this problem. Eviction and the homelessness that may result increase poverty, can lead to loss of employment, threaten health, undermine children's schooling. That's to name just a few of the possible consequences. At the same time, landlords need to receive sufficient rent to cover their costs and earn a reasonable rate of return on their investments in housing. This is often the income that small landlords depend on for their living. So the eviction problem needs attention. We need to understand more about what's going on, and we need to identify and implement ways to reduce evictions. So our two speakers have been working on this issue in Detroit, where eviction threats and evictions themselves are even more common than in the state as a whole. The first speaker I'll introduce is Alexa Eisenberg. She received a PhD in public health, and now she's in her second year of a postdoctoral fellowship with Poverty Solutions in the School of Public Health. So, Alexa, go ahead.
Thank you, Margie. I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation started. One moment. How's that? Can everyone see the presentation? I'll take no information as affirmative. Okay, well, I'm also nervous. Thank you, Margie. And to just give a little introduction to myself, I'm Alexa Eisenberg. I am a researcher at UM and a resident of Detroit, as well as a housing justice organizer here. And so my work reflects this fusion of identities where organizing informs my research and research can hopefully strengthen the organizing that I'm involved with. And I actually came to this project specifically in the summer of 2020, as many of the pandemic eviction policies I'll be discussing today came into effect. And there is a very clear need among anti-eviction groups in the city that for data on eviction, so they could be responding to the crisis, whether that be canvassing homes that were of people who were at risk for eviction, holding politicians accountable for the enforcement of various protections, or just translating complex policy information into communications that people could actually understand. And so my skills as a researcher allowed me to become involved in this work, and it's continued ever since. I want to thank the Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative for having me today, and a special congratulations to my fearless advisor, Roshanik. It's an honor to serve on this panel with two truly incredible people, Margie, who's also been a mentor to me for many years, and whose statewide eviction research provides the foundation for this work, and Tonya Phillips, who combines this fierce advocacy and leadership with a really compassionate humility, and whose work with the Detroit Right to Counsel Coalition gives this work also direction and meaning. And so the title of my talk today is a public health crisis, not a property dispute, learning from COVID-19 eviction response measures in Detroit. It's also the title of a policy brief that was published this week on the subject by me and my co-author. And I present this talk on the traditional lands and territory of the Anishinaabe people. So I want to say a quick acknowledgement to my supportive team at Poverty Solutions, as well as the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative for funding this work, Data Driven Detroit for translating this into a reality, the incredible Kate Brantley, who's my co-author and thought partner on this work, and finally, Detroit Eviction Defense, which is my organizing home in Detroit, whose work fighting eviction injustice informed the data collection effort that ultimately became this project. And I also wish to acknowledge the many tenants who I have be able to get to know and learn from and work alongside in DED. I want to start by taking a moment to just remind all of us that while today I will be presenting numbers and statistics, what we're really talking about are people's lives. Disproportionately Black people, disabled people, women, and children. We will get into the nitty-gritty of the legal eviction process, but I do not want this nuance to detract us from a very simple fact that evictions are violent and unjust. This is true whether they're occurring legally or illegally, for just cause or no cause, whether they're happening during a pandemic or outside of one. And I say this for two reasons. One is as a content warning, particularly for anyone who's experienced the trauma of housing instability. And two, to make clear that while our society has normalized mass evictions, there's absolutely nothing acceptable about the current system. And as a white person with a professional degree in historically stable housing, I am not an expert on the subject, but my work seeks to create transparency and shine light on the policies and systems that perpetuate injustice. And much of what I present today simply quantifies what tenants living in Detroit have long known. And nothing of what I'll say today can describe with any integrity the fear, disruption, and dehumanization that the legal eviction process causes. The research I'm presenting today also lives on a website called the Eviction Machine, and this is a place where tenants and organizers, advocates can view the data in real time using interactive tools where they can do research on their landlords, learn about the legal eviction process, as well as find resources for preventing and fighting eviction. And so I encourage you to check this out as well. And so now I want to begin with a little bit of context. So stable housing is not just a human right, but it's also a cornerstone of health and well-being. There's a bunch of research that links the stress, trauma, and material fallout of eviction to an array of adverse health consequences, not just for families who experience eviction, but for communities where evictions are concentrated. And of course, we know eviction is not an equal opportunity stressor. Because the power and property relationships that give rise to eviction are structured by white supremacy and capitalism, eviction is an omnipresent feature of low-income tenancy that disparately impacts renters of color, particularly Black women and children. And so now this is to say that mass evictions threatened public health long before the onset of the pandemic. But as COVID-19 struck in March of 2020, the life and death consequences of eviction could no longer be ignored. To prevent millions of evictions that would have exacerbated the spread of COVID-19, policymakers made abrupt changes to eviction policy, placing moratoria on various stages of the eviction process, modifying court procedures to give tenants the opportunity to access services and exercise their rights, and allocating unprecedented public funding for emergency rental assistance and legal aid. And while COVID-19 eviction response measures sought to prevent this wave of mass evictions, cities across the US had long endured a flood. To demonstrate, here's a table of the top 10 cities in Metro Detroit with the highest eviction filing rates prior to the pandemic. First, I just want you to note how high these rates are. In each jurisdiction, the equivalent of 1 in 5 tenants faced an eviction filing each year. In Detroit, this translated to approximately 30,000 filings, or at least 70,000 tenants facing the threat of eviction in a given year. For instance, this is 2019, a visual representation of this. Yet Detroit falls relatively low on this list. In Romulus, for instance, a startling half of all renters might face an eviction in a given year, nearly 3 times the state average, which is itself extremely high. But what's very clear is from this data is eviction's disparate impact on renters in Black communities, with the most impacted jurisdictions being majority Black or disproportionately Black compared to the rest of the state. And so in a place like Detroit, a majority Black city where most poor renters, as is the case in the rest of the United States, receive no housing assistance and spend at least half of their incomes on housing, COVID-19 eviction response measures stood not only to prevent a wave of housing loss brought on by the pandemic, but disrupt a status quo of mass displacement that systematically harms Black and brown people. So before this research, we knew that eviction filing rates in Detroit and across the state were incredibly high, but we didn't know much else. And this is because comprehensive real-time eviction data simply doesn't exist in Michigan as well as the rest of the nation. The data cited earlier took years for researchers to obtain, and it lacked detail on what happens after a case is filed in court. So when the pandemic struck in March of 2020, the public, as well as policymakers, had little way to monitor the implementation and enforcement of new measures or to evaluate their impacts. To address this need, we compiled Detroit's first comprehensive, publicly accessible, and real-time eviction court process dataset. To obtain this data, we retrieved case records from the 36 District Court's online register of action system, and then translated this information into a quantitative data set. Learning how to do this took about 2 years. The data I'm presenting today covers cases filed between January 2019 and June of 2022. And it's important to note that this data offers a very limited lens on eviction injustice, as research suggests that the majority of forced moves occur illegally and informally outside of the court system. Here is a schematic of the legal eviction process, which occurs in 5 stages. Our data captures information from the point a landlord files a case in court, after which the court schedules a hearing and in some cases a trial. The court may then enter a judgment or a decision to determine who will have possession of the property or how much money is owed. If a tenant does not appear at their hearing, a judge will rule in favor of the landlord by default. However, at any point, a case may be dismissed by a landlord or the court. This is the most ideal outcome for a tenant because in eviction court, almost all judgments favor landlords. And it's important to note that displacement pressure is present and increasing throughout the eviction process. And even an eviction filing, regardless of a case's outcome, can be screened by landlords and used against tenants later on to preclude them from future housing opportunities. However, the most violent and disruptive stage of the eviction process is the bailiff eviction, when a judge authorizes a court officer to forcibly unhouse a tenant and throw all of their belongings into a dumpster if they have not moved out by a court-ordered date. This typically occurs when a tenant either has no knowledge of their eviction or when they simply have nowhere else to go. I want to take a step back for a moment and to say that in Michigan, as in all states, the law creates an especially fast court process for evictions called a summary proceeding. Before the pandemic, the entire eviction process, from a missed rental payment to the physical removal of a tenant, could occur in as little as 27 days. And unlike criminal cases, there's no right to counsel for tenants facing eviction who cannot afford lawyers. And as the name eviction machine suggests, eviction courts, especially in urban jurisdictions like Detroit, do not operate like systems for dispensing justice, but systems for enabling represented landlords to quickly bring eviction actions and get judgments against poor and mostly unrepresented tenants. It's also important to note that during the pandemic, all eviction proceedings moved online to Zoom, and the court began holding pretrial hearings, giving tenants slightly more time to access the virtual courtroom, and legal aid attorneys who were funded through COVID relief money to be present in all Zoom courtrooms to provide legal advice and in some cases offer legal representation to tenants. Now we'll move on to our findings, beginning with the first stage of eviction. This graph shows the number of eviction filings in Detroit since the start of 2020 and the implementation periods of various moratoria and rental assistance programs. These began with strong state and local moratoria that initially halted new filings, which were then replaced by the state's eviction diversion program, which sought to dismiss cases through rental assistance. The CDC moratorium, which required tenants to opt in and only applied to non-payment of rent cases. And finally, the COVID Emergency Rental Assistance, or SARA program, which offered up to 18 months of past and future rent payments, but which closed to new applicants in June of 2022. And what we see essentially is that filings have been rising since state and local moratoria were lifted in the summer of 2020. And despite the implementation of various eviction prevention measures, including over $300 million in rental assistance allocated for the city of Detroit, landlords still managed to file about 32,000 new eviction cases against tenants since the onset of the pandemic, just as of June. And filings increased in 2022, reaching about 75% of the pre-pandemic level halfway through the year. But when we look at these as annual rates per 100 renters, we see that after falling to historic lows, the projected filing rate in 2022 shows that, assuming that trends continued, which is modest given escalating rental increases, shows that eviction filings are on track to return to pre-pandemic levels as COVID-19 protections expire. This would impact the equivalent of about 61,000 tenants by the end of this year alone. The next set of findings looks at whether landlords are compliant with the city of Detroit's rental ordinance when they filed for an eviction. As most of us know, rental agreements are a two-way street, or at least they should be. A tenant pays rent in exchange for a landlord providing a safe and decent place to live. Under the city's rental ordinance, landlords must meet basic health and safety codes, including a lead clearance, before lawfully renting out their properties, and hold what is called a certificate of compliance in order to collect rent from tenants. This graph shows filings broken down according to whether the rental property was certified as code compliant at the stage of filing. And your eyes are not deceiving you, the graph is correct. What it is showing you is that about 9 in 10 eviction cases filed during the pandemic involved properties that were operated in violation of the city's rental ordinance. This is indicative not just of a lack of code enforcement in the court, where landlords are allowed to file for eviction regardless of whether they themselves are following the law, but a broader lack of code enforcement across Detroit, as just less than 10% of all Detroit rental properties as of July in 2022 were code compliant. Next, we look at reasons landlords filed for eviction and how these changed over time as policymakers relied increasingly on primarily on rental assistance programs to prevent evictions after the lapse of state and local moratoria. So what this graph shows is that while most evictions filed during the pandemic were for non-payment of rent, the share of cases filed without cause was increasing over time. Under Michigan law, landlords can terminate the tenancy of renters who have month-to-month leases or after a lease term expires, without needing to provide a substantive cause. There are few protections in place for tenants who are facing no-cause evictions generally, and during the pandemic, these cases could not necessarily be prevented through the provision of rental assistance, as landlords may not want to accept it. We found the termination of tenancy or no-cause evictions increased by about 70% after the state's rental assistance program began. And the increase, as you can see, was somewhat steady over time. Termination of tenancy cases comprised about 1 in 3 filings in 2022, and as much as 40% of filings in June of this year. The increase in no-cause evictions during the pandemic is very concerning. It signifies that landlords are taking advantage of a loophole in COVID eviction prevention measures, electing not to participate in the SARA program or evicting afterwards, potentially in search of higher paying tenants amid the tightening pandemic era housing market as rental prices are reaching unprecedented highs. Tenants who are most at risk for termination of tenancy are those with informal leases, who often live at the bottom of the housing market where rents are more affordable, but housing conditions are often unsafe. Given tenants limited legal protections and access to legal counsel, termination of tenancy are often an easy avenue for landlords retaliating against tenants who complain or who work with other tenants to organize to better their conditions. Looking at judgments, overall, we have seen that judgments declined greatly since the onset of the pandemic, about 62% when we compare the proportion of closed cases ending in a judgment during COVID versus before. However, due to the lack of protections I just mentioned, tenants being evicted for termination of tenancy were twice as likely as tenants facing eviction for non-payment of rent to receive a judgment. It's also extremely important to note that just because a case is dismissed does not guarantee that a renter remains in a property, as legal aid attorneys have said that many dismissals entered during the pandemic were conditional upon the tenant getting paid rental assistance and moving. However, we cannot capture this in our data. Here we see that prior to the pandemic, 4 in every 10 cases filed ended in a judgment by default against tenants who never had their day in court. Since the pandemic, defaults declined 40%, suggesting that measures have been somewhat effective in increasing access to the courtroom. However, still 1 in 4 cases ended in a default judgment, and defaults comprise the vast majority of pandemic-era judgments. So while Zoom court may lessen some of the logistical barriers to court attendance, other systemic barriers persist, including the fact that about 1 in 3 low-income households in Detroit lacks broadband internet access. This is concerning for many, many reasons, but especially because interventions like legal aid and even rental assistance could only prevent evictions for tenants who were able to appear and access those resources in the court. And as for bailiff evictions, the very violent process we discussed earlier, we found that a staggering 31% of cases closed during the pandemic resulted in bailiff evictions. More than 8,000 orders of eviction were entered in 2019 alone, forcibly unhousing about 60 renters per day. Since March 2020, about 10% of closed cases ended in a bailiff eviction, still amounting to approximately 10 renters, including many children, evicted each day in 2021 across all corners of the city. And finally, we are looking at legal representation. We saw that tenants' access to legal counsel increased during the pandemic due to public investments in legal services. However, capacity remained very limited, and about 1 in 4 tenants who attended court and about 1 in 5 tenants overall received full representation from a lawyer. Hence, while the disparity in access to legal counsel has declined somewhat, landlords are still 4 times more likely than tenants to have attorneys. And so in conclusion, the past 2 years demonstrate that mass evictions are a policy choice. This research suggests that COVID-19 eviction response measures reduce the scale of Detroit's eviction crisis relative to past years, demonstrating that new levels of eviction prevention are attainable when policymakers treat eviction like a public health crisis rather than a property dispute. Yet, the unprecedented level of eviction prevention attained during the pandemic exists only in contrast to a status quo of racialized mass displacement that is unjust and unacceptable. We saw that evictions remained a pervasive threat, even with a range of prevention measures in place. The most robust eviction protections were short-lived, and unprecedented public investments in rental assistance and legal aid programs did not remedy the power imbalance between landlords and tenants that pervades the legal eviction process. Major policy and enforcement gaps reinforce this power dynamic, and contributed to thousands of avoidable evictions. One lesson learned from COVID-19 eviction response measures in Detroit is clear, that evictions are preventable, but they are inevitable within a for-profit housing system that prioritizes landlords' investment interests over tenants' health and human right to shelter. And so while as eviction filings, as we saw, return to pre-pandemic levels and rents across the US are soaring to new highs, decision makers can choose to continue to normalize this public health crisis or work to monitor, prevent, and eradicate it, taking a lesson from public health itself. I'll discuss some of the strategies for doing so based on research from Detroit and best practices in other jurisdictions. So monitoring the crisis at a minimum must involve governmental data collection and transparency that allows us to investigate eviction inequities and develop a sustained effort to address the root causes. It also involves automatically sealing eviction records at the stage of filing so they cannot be used by landlords to discriminate against tenants in the future. Prevention involves strategies that can mitigate some of the harm of evictions. For instance, we could enforce city and state rental codes at the stage of eviction filing, ensuring that courts are honoring both sides of the rental agreement, not just the landlord's or the tenant's obligation. Establishing just cause and right to renew policies that can curb arbitrary and retaliatory evictions. Using our new Democratic majority to legalize rent control in Michigan and passing these protections. Using budget surpluses at the state level to supplement the loss of federal rental assistance with mandatory eviction diversion programs. Banning evictions that cause a threat to human life during the winter or child development during the school year. And as Tonya will discuss, it's imperative that we implement and fully fund the City of Detroit's newly passed Right to Counsel ordinance, which is currently being delayed and neglected by leadership. However, to eradicate the US's racially unjust eviction crisis and to achieve true housing justice, we need to fundamentally alter the US housing system to guarantee housing as a social good. And actually, officials at all levels of government have the power and the resources to expand social housing that is permanently affordable, protected from the private market, and publicly owned or under a democratic community control model. But don't listen to me. A truly equitable housing policy framework must be developed by and accountable to people who are most impacted by systematic injustice and displacement. Across the US, including in Detroit, there is an organized tenant movement that is making their voices heard and championing a range of political solutions. We just simply need to listen. On that, I will leave you with a call to action, which I'll include in the chat, as activists this week in Detroit are calling for a moratorium on evictions until the right to counsel is made a reality. And I will give you some more information, especially if you live in Detroit, for how to plug into this. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time today and for listening and caring about this subject.
Thank you, Alexa. That was a lot. Our second speaker is Tonya Phillips. She's an attorney who serves as the Community Partnerships and Development Director for the Sugar Law Center and for the Sugar Law Center for Economic and Social Justice. And she also serves as Public Policy Advisor with Michigan Legal Services on housing policies for low-income people. And therefore has been heavily involved in eviction issues. Tonya.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone for coming today and being tuned in and plugged into this very important and critical subject that we're talking about today. I want to thank my colleague and ally in good trouble, Dr. Alexa Eisenberg, and thank the University of Michigan in this exciting Health Solutions initiative for inviting me to co-present today. So I'm going to focus a lot about a very specific evidence-based solution, the right to counsel for low-income persons facing eviction. I'm going to talk from a macro and a micro lens and eagerly anticipate questions. So with that, I'll be getting some assistance from Jameson on my slides, and we'll begin. First, I want to talk about, a little bit of what we've been through, just acknowledge what we've been through during the pandemic. The topic of this workshop is very relevant. Looking at eviction lenses, what did we learn when we decided to examine evictions from a public health perspective? During the pandemic and COVID, Detroiters and Michiganders have been through a lot. I just have some screenshots on the left, or my left, looking at COVID trends. The first is total amount of cases. The graphics are a little bit small, but the darker areas are the larger numbers of COVID cases. Michigan overall has had nearly 3 million documented COVID cases, and we know early in the pandemic, when we didn't know a lot about this particular virus, there were a lot of undercounts. So this number is just an official number, but we all know it's likely an undercount. And nearly 40,000 deaths in Michigan. And the red graph exemplifies that in showing the number of deaths that we've had in Michigan, and by county, we had a disproportionate amount of persons who were impacted by the virus and ultimately lost their lives to COVID, and people are still grieving because of COVID. And it's important to acknowledge that. In Detroit, we had and we continue to experience severe flooding. It's not new, but the system changes that are needed to prevent these massive floods from occurring have not yet been put in place. So against the backdrop of COVID, Detroiters were particularly and disproportionately impacted by severe flooding, destroying a lot of property. And of course, unemployment also disproportionately impacted Detroiters. Many of us on this call have the privilege of being able to call in and work from home or work from Zoom or whatnot, but many people lost their livelihood during COVID, and the unemployment rate surged to more than 38%. So against that backdrop, Detroiters have been through a lot, Michiganders have been through a lot, and it's important to acknowledge that. Slide. What have we learned? We learned we can stop mass evictions and displacement using public policy tools. And one important tool is a right to counsel. And just to provide basic information to make sure we're all on the same page with what a right to counsel means, I want to go over some things or a framework in which the Detroit Right to Counsel Coalition and advocates, what we mean when we say right to counsel. First of all, it's a national movement, and it recognizes the need for legal representation as a right for tenants and all people that are facing eviction, really. Legal representation is protected in a criminal proceeding. It's a constitutional right, Supreme Court, down to the state, down to local government. But in eviction cases, we don't have any equivalent. So if you're facing the loss of your home, imminent homelessness, too bad for you if you can't afford a lawyer. When we say right to counsel, we mean that would require city, or we could say, or state government to provide and fund full legal representation for tenants or persons facing eviction. So this is not advice. We give you a little advice and send you on your way. This is when a lawyer is fighting for you and representing you. And finally, a right to counsel, as it is titled, is a legal right. It's an ordinance. It's a statute. It's the law. It is not a program that can go up and down from year to year that's dependent on grants. It is a public right. Slide. So we've learned from looking at trends all across the country that a right to counsel works in eviction proceedings. Overall, it's kind of common sense. When we're represented by a lawyer, the odds are better you're going to have a successful outcome in your case. And when most tenants are represented by a lawyer, full representation, they're able to stay in their homes and not be evicted. We learned from New York that 84% of households represented in court With legal representation, were able to stay in their homes. Thousands of tenancies were saved. Martial evictions, or what we would call bailiff evictions, when your belongings are forcibly removed and placed out on the street, declined by 41% since the implementation of their right to counsel law that was implemented in 2017. Eviction filings have decreased by 30%, and default judgments have decreased by 34%. And just in terms of terminology, I want to make sure we're all on the same page, because right to counsel has layered effects. We see there's a reduction in judgments or bailiff evictions when you're literally pushed out of your home. But the eviction filing rate begins to decrease in right to counsel jurisdictions as well, because it's known that a lawyer is going to represent, there is an enforcement mechanism. So there's less of an incentive for a landlord who's not following the law to just file a case and see what happens. You know, in Michigan, the incentives are out of line. You know, it's only $55, costs $55 roughly to file an eviction case in Michigan. So it's really not a lot to lose, you know, from a landlord perspective in terms of delaying filing a case. So eviction and right to counsel jurisdictions, eviction filing rates come down and participation in the system goes up. A default judgment is when someone hasn't appeared, hasn't even showed up for the fight. And we see more people appearing and enforcing their legal rights and right to counsel jurisdictions. In San Francisco, eviction filings decreased by 10% over a year, and 67% of persons who are represented by a lawyer stayed in their home. A study in Minnesota found that tenants won or settled their case 96% of the time when they received limited representation, or 83% of the time overall. Tenants with full representation were twice as likely than others to stay in their home, or got twice as much time to move and be able to settle in a dignified manner instead of being rushed out and kicked out on the streets, and were 4 times less likely to use homeless shelters. And you can check out the website, the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, and the estimated economic impact of a eviction right to counsel in Detroit for these statistics. Slide. We know right to counsel works in Detroit, so it's good to look at what's happening nationwide, but we've studied this at home. We don't need to study it anymore. We know that right to counsel works in Detroit. So we've learned that represented tenants right here in Detroit are nearly 18 times more likely to avoid disruptive displacement than tenants who are unrepresented. 18 times is a good statistic. It's worthy of investing in. Our people are worthy of investing in. This is pulled again from the Stout report, and you can check that out. I'll drop the link before we leave the workshop today. This particular report also estimates conservatively at least 6,400 renter households, or approximately a little over 19,000 people, will likely avoid disruptive displacement, eviction, and negative impacts. And I want to underscore here that this particular study looked at data ranging from 2017 to 2019. So these numbers do not include companion policy interventions or public policy decisions, such as implementing eviction diversion programs or providing emergency rental assistance. So when you layer on companion policies, we can really, really make a difference in keeping people in their home. And as you saw from Alexa's research in 2020 and 2021, layering on these interventions reduced evictions significantly. In a way, prior to 2020, we were told was just simply not possible. Slide. Right now, we can't afford more evictions. We have lost precious time by not implementing the right to counsel and approaching pre-pandemic eviction levels again. This slide was prepared before the ordinance passed, but unfortunately, you know, we haven't gotten things where we want. But what's happening without right to counsel being implemented? 1, blight, which leads to evictions caused by vacancy in homes. Demolition costs are soaring and out of control. Homelessness and homeless shelters are at capacity. There's not a lot of places to go when one loses their home through an eviction process. Oh, I'm running out of time. I was about to go through it quickly. Housing stability, mental trauma, reduced population and tax base. In short, Detroiters are harmed, but we can offset these harms and mitigate these harms by a right to counsel. Slide. Black women are disproportionately impacted by a right to counsel, Black women and low-income households. So it's important to name and acknowledge who's being harmed and also who benefits with these eviction policies or lack thereof. Slide. Displacement and population loss. Without a right to counsel in place, just looking at the status quo, Detroit, there's evidence that Detroit is beginning to hemorrhage populations. The Stout report estimates that as many as 24,000 Detroiters could have been displaced following an eviction filing. Other studies estimate it could be as large as 41% of tenants who face eviction are not able to return to their home or return to Detroit. Slide. The right to counsel approach, we don't accept that. Detroiters organized, and the way we organize, I want to uplift. The Detroit right to counsel brings in tenants, organizers, residents, nonprofits, legal aid groups, progressive Detroit officials, progressive court officials. We go where the people are and rely on grassroots organizing, relationship building, word of mouth, not only social media posts, but relationship building in the way we organize. And at the center of our organizing and policy solutions, we center the experience of Black and Indigenous persons. We believe in shared power, shared decision-making. Slide is cut off a little bit, but making sure that people who are actually impacted by these policies and people that are actually living in the city of Detroit, that our demographics and our needs are reflected in these policy decisions. Slide. So on May 10th, after a couple of years, we won our right to counsel ordinance. We are the 15th city in the nation and the first city in Michigan to pass a right to counsel. The ordinance has very detailed legislative findings, which is important when you're looking to enforce an ordinance. It covers all households at 200% of the federal poverty level. It's a very broad ordinance. It covers all cases that arrive at 36th District Court, whether it's tenants, homeowners, foreclosure, rentals, and illegal lockouts and appeals are covered. It mandates an Office of Eviction Defense, robust data collection, as we see the importance of that. It mandates or specifies ARPA funding can be used when available. And then after that, the funding stream is neutral. Our council is with us and has indicated its approval through resolution of $30 million in ARPA funding over 3 years. Slide. Now, where is the money going to implement or reflect what policy decision is being preferred right now? So right to counsel by our administration has only been allocated $6 million over 3 years. That's not enough to get the kind of results, that we see and that we know are possible. On the other hand, commercial demolition, not residential demolition, commercial demolition is receiving a $95 million investment of American Rescue Plan Act funds. And there's landlord support with no affordability requirements, no tenancy requirements. There's still a lot of unknowns about what landlord support exactly means, but it's getting $5 million. And the point here, go to the next slide. We have to close. What's next? The Right to Counsel Coalition, Detroiters are continuing to organize. So we're working with our district court, local, state, and national housing stakeholders to fully fund and equitably implement our ordinance, because we know what is possible when it's fully resourced. And we also advocate for companion policies, many of which Alexa shared today. Last slide. So if you want to keep in touch, text us, like our Facebook page, send us an email. But we've had some wins, the fight isn't over, and we're advocating because we know we can have a more just and equitable society if we choose as a society to implement the right public policy tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Tonya.
Mhm.
As you've been talking, both of you, I have a question about how did you do the organizing? Because we heard the analysis, and we heard the analysis of that Alexa did. We heard the analysis that the Stout report did as a backup leading into right to counsel efforts. But how, and Tonya, you did say, reaching out, making alliances and things, but can you say a little bit more about that, both of you? Because I know you've both been involved. And it's been quite, from afar, my view of it is it's been quite impressive.
Thank you so much. The people are at the center. You cannot replace or substitute people power and the voice of people. Right to counsel, I would say, has been a little more popular before 2019 in legal services circles. But when Detroit residents decide to get involved and own this issue, I shouldn't say decide to get involved, just got involved, took control and own this issue and kind of overlapped it with reality. It's not only data, it's not only statistics, it's not only a better constitutional framework, it's the humanity of it, that people's lives are changed, neighborhoods are improved. So when you begin to look at things as housing as a human right, and you look at it as a human issue, and residents are empowered to speak for themselves and say, I want this as a policy. Detroiters came down to city council, Detroiters wrote emails, Detroiters sent letters, and Detroiters continue to organize and got it done. So the data helps. It is absolutely a great help in terms of organizing, but you have to allow people to have space. And even when systems don't allow people to have space, we move forward and made our own space anyway. So there's nothing that replaces people. Mm-hmm.
Alexa, do you want to add something to that?
Sure. I can just comment on the role of someone who is a researcher by background and someone who is clearly operating in an academic space and has access to not only resources from the university, but, things like I have a voice. I'm on a webinar right now. People are listening to me. I think a lot of it has just involved time and showing up and taking leadership from people who have been doing work for a lot longer than me and who are a lot closer to these issues than I am, but then also realizing that I have my own contributions that I can offer, and that as a researcher, I have the privilege of taking the time to understand, various policies as they're coming into effect. And then I have some skills that I've developed over the years in terms of, I mentioned, like translating information into things that can be accessible for folks. What do organizers need to know to inform their work? What resources can I access through the university to support research activities that maybe don't look, traditionally like research activities, but are very much informing work that university values and has value to the public, which the university should value. So that's been my strategy.
Okay, so we have questions from the audience, and we have a few more minutes for you to answer these. So for Alexa first, did you look into any of the connection between no-cause terminations and the rise in home sales? During the pandemic, maybe landlords were selling their housing units rather than continuing to rent them. Any sign of that you saw?
I did not look at that. It's somewhat difficult in the data that I use to link across property records, though not impossible. But I haven't looked at that, and it's an interesting hypothesis that I would be curious to look at, and it makes a lot of sense that is the case. And although I haven't heard a lot of a lot of that happening in my kind of like anecdotal experience talking to tenants who are evicted. I wouldn't put it outside of the realm of possibility.
Okay, and a question for Tonya. So indigent criminal defendants who lose at trial are held liable for a portion of the cost of their case and the public defender attorney fees. Could tenants receiving legal representation through right to counsel also be held liable for part of the court and attorney costs if they lose?
One, I'm not a criminal defense attorney, but I'm not sure that's completely accurate. But we're gonna double check that. Or at least that's not what I've seen. Again, that's not my practice, but I double check the code on that. But should you be charged for your legal representation? No, we think of this as a right, and part of that framework is because a person is low income in the city of Detroit, that means it's the city of Detroit's responsibility to provide the cost of legal representation and outreach and supportive services. So no, that should not be charged back to a person under any circumstances.
Okay. And another one for you, Tonya. Can you share your thoughts about why the city of Detroit's slow walking this implementation of right to counsel? What is it that's interfering, given the many benefits that might result?
Well, that's a good question, and it's certainly a question for our mayor. Our council did pass the ordinance. Our council provided resolutions that indicate their support for funding. The initiation of that funding does come from the mayor's office. Our RFP has been released, but the amount of money is negligible. Why? I don't know, but I put in the slide, where the major investment for ARPA funds seems to be going, and it seems to be an investment in demolition or displacement after the fact, I guess, making way for new commercial enterprises. That's my speculation. But in a sense, the reason I don't think it matters too much when you pass the law, we're beyond what one thinks about the matter. We're into implementing the law at this time. And that's what our coalition is advocating for, from our city council and our mayor, to enforce the law that has been passed.
And we can mention that Gilbert Family Foundation has put in funds to support legal aid providers in representing tenants, even without the start of the program.
Yeah, it has been, there was a grant made to 3 legal aid organizations in Detroit, and the grant, helps keep the doors open, I guess, essentially. It wasn't enough money to provide coverage to all the individuals, all the Detroiters that are eligible under the ordinance. So that is good for the organizations to keep their doors open, while the city of Detroit gets right to counsel together in terms of funding and opening up services to Detroiters. But it wasn't a gift that was large enough to serve everyone that's eligible under the ordinance. And also, we have to distinguish between private and public. It is a grant, and grants go away, they come and go. But it's important to have a systemic, permanent infrastructure in place so we can get these filings down permanently, we can get the eviction rate down permanently, and we could have another tool that leads to housing stability in Detroit permanently.
Another question for you, Alexa. Do you advocate right to counsel for unrepresented landlords?
I hadn't really considered that question. I may be a better question for Tonya, but I do know that landlords who are unrepresented tend to violate the law even more than landlords who do have representation. But I haven't thought about this enough to kind of think about that. But given the scarcity of resources, I'm not sure I would feel confident about saying yes.
I would say no, definitely no. And the reason why is first we look at the disproportionate representation. We know that landlords have representation in over 90% of their cases. And before the pandemic, tenants or homeowners were at 4%. Now we're up to roughly about 20. So there's already a disparity of power. And right to counsel speaks to public resources. Public resources should be invested in residents and citizens, not private corporations. Landlords are private corporations. I know we talk about mom and pops. There are very few quote unquote mom and pops that are not registered as a corporation. So a right to counsel is a public investment in a city or municipality or state makes in its people, human people. So my answer to that would be no.
Well, and the right to counsel itself is to protect human rights, not the profits of or the investment incomes of landlords.
I know we're running out of time, but if I could add just 2 words. Now, if you want to provide educational support for landlords to better follow the law and understand their obligations, you should absolutely do that as a city. There should be education.
And some of that is happening a little bit anyway.
Mhm.
So, Roshanik, we'll turn it over to you.
I want to thank you all for just an amazing presentation, very, very informative, and very, as I said, it's one of the, I couldn't have imagined a better inaugural speaker series event. And I want to thank the audience for attending today. Please keep an eye out for more information on our upcoming monthly speaker series. We've also, Jameson has just posted our website. You can go on there to learn more about some of the work that we do. And as more information comes along, we'll be posting more opportunities and a newsletter going out to inform you all of more information. I realize we didn't get to all the Q&As. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you again to the speakers.